Good afternoon, beautiful people. Welcome to another episode of Kiko's Free Thinkers Forum. This is a special episode 83, believe it or not. I say 83 because 82 technically wasn't notated as an episode, but I considered it an episode with the presidential forum that we just had on Friday. So this is technically episode 83, featuring a repeat guest and a new guest, Carlos Garrido and Noah Khrachvik. And they're both part of the Midwestern Marx Institute. And I'm going to let them explain their involvement in the Midwestern Marx Institute themselves. But I just want to say that I'm very excited for this interview because we're going to build off of what we talked about in episode 54 with Carlos Garrido in his book, The Purity Fetish and the Crisis of Western Marxism. A lot of our conversation will deal with this. And I have some burning questions for Noah and Carlos. But I just want to say welcome to the show, Noah, for the first time, and Carlos, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, brother.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. Oh,
I'm impressed you got Noah's last name pronunciation correct. It took me like a good 6 months to get it down.
You got
to do your homework.
Yeah.
I'm going to pause, hesitate, but I'm going to get his pronunciation right. That's what I'm going to do. But a small ad before we start. I just want to say thanks to all the beautiful listeners and viewers out there. Kiko's Free Thinkers Forum is about 15 months in operation. We've reached over 165 different countries. We've reached every state in the country. We've also met so many different milestones. We have 43% of our audience outside of the United States. So we have a true international community on Kiko's Free Thinkers Forum. And I want to say that 2 weeks ago, we were officially monetized as a YouTube channel. So again, thanks for all the support. And your support goes a long way. I'm not asking really for your money. I'm just asking for a simple subscribe for free, a little bit of your time to expand your mind. And remember, you can't unthink free thought. So let's continue with the conversation, episode 54, more or less. And I have a question for you two. I'm curious, and I know some of the audience is going to be absolutely stoked once I post this interview later today, because I got so many requests. You have to get these two guys on together. So that we made it happen. As far as Bernie Sanders is concerned, I don't pretend to be this expert when it comes to political theory per se. Like, I'm not going to say that I'm not politically conscious. I am, but I don't get too caught up in the labels. But I've noticed a trend with a lot of the people on the so-called left in the United States, and we can maybe get into what exactly is the left in the United States. Why is it that everyone that I know, including myself, why was everyone at some point associated with Bernie Sanders, and where does that go from that point, especially in 2015 to now? It just seems like everyone is in their own lane, but at one point it seems like there was so much solidarity around one figure in Bernie Sanders. What exactly happened with that, and why is it that the U.S. left is only associated with that segment of thought?
Do you want to take this, Carlos, or you want me to?
Yeah. I mean, I got politically active through the Bernie movement at 16. So, for I think a lot of Americans, it was first an excitement in a lot of sectors that were apolitical or that because of their age were like pre-political. I know for me, Bernie 16 campaign came in when I was senior year of high school. I started working with the Bernie people in South Florida, and it helped answer questions that had been created for me, some of the contradictions in the system that had been previously created for me, and it helped what we call in philosophy answer certain questions that arose out of certain events. So I had the story, I've told it a few times in the channel. My mom has my sister, she develops fibromes. She can't pay for medical treatment. And the question becomes like, either do I get the surgery that I need to survive, but put my family in tremendous debt, or do I just roll with it and prevent the debt weighing down on my family? She rolled with it. All of our friends from Cuba who lambast the Cuban Revolution and socialism 24/7 were telling her, just go to Cuba, get that operation done. It's free over there. So, I mean, I was a young 12, 11-year-old at that time, but I'm asking these questions like, what is this? That broke the everydayness of my life. It brought up a genuine question. What's going on here? And it was one that I could begin to answer with the Bernie campaign, because we started talking about the role of of profit and the commodification of medicine and all these different things. And he was phrasing what he was doing, the sort of movement that he was creating as a political revolution. So when we're active in his campaign, we know there's limitations, but we're thinking of it as a genuine political revolution, as a radical transformation of the country. We're obviously disappointed twice. The first time, as Assange shows, he gets cheated by the DNC. The second time, he gets cheated, but in a much more open way. Obama calls all of the candidates, tell them, yo, drop out. The fact that there were even that many candidates, you can even say that it's beginning to set up what eventually ended up happening when Obama made those phone calls. But so he basically gets cheated twice. He just takes it to the jaw. He doesn't fight back. He doesn't do anything. We knew he had always been soft on foreign policy. When they asked him about actual socialist countries, he's like, that's not the socialism I have in mind. I have in mind Scandinavia, which for us, Scandinavia, those are like imperialist social democracies. They benefit from the system of imperialism. They're like if you're doing a heist, they're the people driving the car. Sure, they're not coming out on camera as the key players, but they're still benefiting from the heist. And they're benefiting in a more insidious form because no one even points the finger at them when it comes to the key imperialist powers. But he's pointing at them as examples of socialism while he lambasts Venezuela, Cuba, the Soviet Union, China, etc., as these horrendous totalitarian governments. So what happened, I think, was that everyone got excited. They realized that, well, this could be a tremendous step forward for the country and advancement in the class struggle. And because of the natural contradictions of that form of socialist, I don't consider it socialist, but socialist, social democratic politics, it fell by its own weight and it showed itself for what it was, a way of perhaps activating certain minds, but at the end of the day, substantially siding with the ruling class on key issues, even though Bernie is still to this day good on some working class issues at home. He's very close to the UAW and other unions that are doing great efforts. But when it comes to imperialism, he's right on the side of imperialism 90 something percent of the time. And this follows the tendency of the Social Democrats all the way back to the Second International at the turn of the 20th century. If I had been theoretically informed about that tendency, maybe I would have had less illusions when I worked with Bernie. It hit, especially us young people, very hard. But coming to see those contradictions play out in real time and then educating ourselves theoretically and historically helped everything make sense. And now when people like Rashida Tlaib do what they just did, there was just a vote to equate anti-Semitism with critiques of Zionism. And she voted present, and the rest of the squad voted in favor of the equating. The only person that voted against it was Thomas Massie, Republican from Kentucky. When stuff like that happens, we're no longer surprised because we know this is how the Social Democrats work. They vacillate. They wake up one day on the side of the bed that they decide to say nice things that align themselves with working people, and on the other day, they wake up on the wrong side of the bed and they're aligned with the ruling class.
Yeah, and I want to add just something real quick to that. When Carlos talks about the inherent contradictions, one of the things these types always fail to tell us is that these international matters are inherently connected to the national conditions of people. If you remember, when did Trump and Bernie really start popping off? It was around the time of Occupy, right? Around the time of Occupy, working class people all over the country were saying, wait a minute, it's Wall Street making our lives miserable. And they started coming together, right? And then suddenly you have Trump and Bernie going at it, splitting people up, ruining the sort of solidarity Occupy began creating. And then since then, if we focus on sort of media, technology, etc., that line that began being drawn between people because of how dangerous Occupy could have been gets exasperated, right? And you get Bernie leaning into one area of ID politics. You get Trump leading into another area of ID politics. And what happens? All these people who used to be on the same page and would have voted Bernie or would have voted Trump, and whoever was talking about increasing their living standards, now they're completely at odds, and they're under the impression that their enemy is the guy next to them at work rather than the guy on Wall Street.
Okay, that's something interesting you said that, Noah. I've said this, I think we go back to episode 2008 with Tyler King. He's a personal friend of ours of the family, and I brought him on as a voter who's like unsure about politics at all. And I was using these comparisons with Trump and Bernie, and he was surprised that why do you keep using those two in comparison? Because most people who focus on politics focus on Democrats, Republicans. Why would the two enemies have so much in common? And I'm like, you have to focus on the support of the people on the ground, not the figureheads. You have to focus on the people. And so I guess my question is, what do those elements have in common besides the fact that they're workers? When we talk about worker consciousness, is there something that those people have in common inherently for them to have that kind of connection to Trump or to Bernie in this case? What are the differences between those groups? Are there really any differences if you dissect them?
That's a really, really insightful question. Because here's the truth: there aren't many differences between working class people in this nation. That they gravitated towards Bernie and Trump is because they were the two people saying, "You regular working class person, I'm going to make your life better in some way," right? Now, neither of them did that, but I believe that it from the Marxist point of view, all of us have the same material interests, and we have the same forces within this society who benefit only at the expense of our interests, and we benefit only at the expense of their interests. In our era, that's the financial, what the communists would say bourgeoisie, or the Trump people would call the establishment or the elites or the globalists. It's all talking about the same thing. Yeah, that's what I would say. I'd say we have a lot more in common than we don't.
Yeah, keep going. I like the way you phrase it in terms of looking at the bases, because so many people, specifically in the left, they just look at some of the rhetoric of the leaders, and they're like, "Oh, this guy's fascist, this guy's a progressive." So, and it's it's once you engage in analysis like that, you're outside of the Marxist framework. The Marxist framework should look at the material forces, the actual objective conditions at play to produce movements like the MAGA movement at the level of a popular people struggle, or that produced the Bernie movement. And I think that what both of them share, and this is something that was the reason why in 2016, before the 2020 Bernie campaign, brought in a lot of DNC staffers and changed the language up a little bit to sound a little bit more idpol. In 2016, there was a big group of working class people who, because Bernie was cheated in the DNC, saw Trump as the only other anti-status quo, anti-establishment alternative. And that's what I think both bases shared. Fundamentally, they see a country that is presenting them with a futureless future, lives which, for the first time in American history, and this is statistically confirmable, for the first time in American history, generations to come will have worse living standards than their parents. That has never happened before. So everyone is fucking done with the status quo. No one wants the same old establishment neoliberalism, and both Trump and Bernie presented themselves as outsiders. In Trump's jargon, people who are going to drain the swamp, fight the deep state. In Bernie's more progressive language, people who are going to fight, the corporate control of politicians and money in politics. So it was able to produce, both of them, popular movements of discontented people. And to some extent, someone like RFK was able to do that at the beginning of his run now as well. Even though he's got those other areas where he's connected to the ruling class very deeply. He's a very deep Zionist, even though his uncle, whose legacy he bases himself on, said at the end of his life, the two people who you have to be the most concerned with are Zionists and religiously anti-communist folk. But at the level of the people's movements, it's mobilizing what Professor Anthony Monteiro calls a movement of the discontented. People who are discontented with the establishment, who want something different, and these are the outlets that they see in front of them as vehicles to taking them somewhere different. Now we might ask, are these outlets, a sort of set up by the ruling elite? so that people don't go to a more radical and substantially anti-elite, anti-establishment area? That's I think, a fair question. I think the Democrats know very well that Trump's whole shtick with working people is I'm the outsider. So when you attack him, as they have been attacking him, for things that the Democrats have done much worse and previous Republican presidents have done much worse, when you do that, that creates a sentiment in their people that confirms Trump's jargon about being anti-establishment, even if his policies were never actually anti-establishment. So I see that perhaps maybe with Bernie as well, maybe with RFK, these are ways of the ruling class presenting to the people, here's your anti-establishment candidate without any substance, get involved in these movements, and hopefully one day you become disillusioned, you become apolitical, and you just take whatever we're giving you to the jaw, and that's it.
Wow. So this is absolutely, I'm not even exaggerating this. It's crazy how much in unison it seems like we are in when it comes to this conversation. Because the question that I have next is a perfect segue, I think. I'm going to ask one question, then we're going to talk a little bit about Stalin, because I know Noah has some time constraints, but I want to get the Soviet Union involvement into this conversation as well. I come from a background Latin America. Like I studied Latin America. Like I have a PhD in Spanish, Latin American literature, and Cuba is my primary country that I focus on. And we also focus on other Latin American countries. I think I've published articles on pretty much 4 or 5 different countries in Latin America. But where this is going is my dissertation director, Don Duke, brought this up to me and said, Kiko, you know, the thing about Cuba is, I asked her a question in class, I'll never forget it, when I was in the program. I said, I hear all this talk about socialism in Cuba, and it kind of reminds me of the talk that we're having now. I hear about the workers a lot. I hear about the conditions on the ground a lot. But where do we find the balance between historically disenfranchised groups within that working sector and the overall worker? Like that's one area I feel like Marxist theory and other areas may have I won't say ignore completely, because I know when Marx published his works back then or whatever, is a completely different context than now. Most of the people that we're talking about now didn't even have basic civil rights. A lot of the workers in general didn't have basic civil rights. But how do we strike that balance between the consciousness of historically disenfranchised groups within the working sector and the overall worker?
You want
That's
me to
a
take a stab at this
brilliant
one first?
question.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Oh, oh, go ahead if you want. I thought we were
Oh,
gonna
yeah.
do the start one once, but yeah, go ahead.
Oh, well, I'm, stupid. So, um, that's a brilliant question. And I think for us, it comes down to the father of American Marxism, W.E.B. Du Bois, who uh, basically what he gives us is the category of the enslaved black worker as a worker, right? As part of this working class with the same interests as the other working class people, right? And for Marxism in general, going through Marx and into Du Bois, the unique struggles of different sections of the working class are all essentially the class struggle. What he says in the Communist Manifesto is that the history of all hitherto existing society is a history of class struggles, plural, meaning different forms of struggle that arise from different historical conditions imposed on different parts of working class people. So Du Bois carries this logic even further and talks about the end of the Civil War as a revolution, and that the revolts of the enslaved black workers was a general strike, denying the Southern planter class all of the labor they needed. That's what really hurt them. And they stand up and they announce their freedom before the entire world. And the Northern soldiers were not okay with this at first. But the revolutionary fervor of these workers forced it and just pushed themselves into it. And it didn't matter if they were okay with it or not, because it was happening. then Reconstruction starts occurring, right? The reconstruction of democracy in the South, because there hadn't been democracy there. This is the first, what Marxists would call, dictatorship of the proletariat in all of human history. And it was done right here in the US with the black workers and the northern white soldiers reinforcing their rule, right, with the freedmen's bureaus. One, we talk about the Paris Commune all the time in Marxism, but this happened first here in the US, and it lasted a lot longer than the Commune did. So why do we not talk about Reconstruction the way we talk about Paris, right? It's because Marx was in Europe and he was commenting on European affairs. But the racism that comes out of the slavery, right, that is created by this mode of production, for lack of a better word, that sort of flatlines the subject in the US for a very long time, especially while we had active Marxists here. I mean, DuBois died still in the Jim Crow era. You know, only now, after the civil rights movement and civil rights revolution, really, it was a political revolution, are we able to understand DuBois as that father of American Marxism and understand that Civil War as a revolution?
That's beautifully said. I second everything there, and I actually just published an article recently on that topic, specifically the importance of Du Bois as the father of American Marxism. It was published, I say unfortunately, in a scholarly setting because it's behind a paywall now, but we hope to do more work on that. But yeah, you're absolutely right, Kiko. There is a tradition of Marxism that ignores that, and that's the Western Marxist tradition. It's not the tradition of Marxism-Leninism. And the way that we see it, I guess to take what Noah was saying to the level of how we would describe it in terms of philosophy, is that there's no such thing as a pure class struggle. That quote from the manifesto, it's plural for a reason. Class struggle is this universal that occurs in every single mode of life, with the exception of the what's called pre-civilization, the communal societies of the past, but exists in every single society that's divided by class. And those class struggles take different forms. Engels says in a very important text, The Origins of the Family, Private Property, and the State, that the first form the class struggle ever took was a struggle against patriarchy. Why? Because if you look at the order, first comes the family. That allows private property to be handed down, because when you don't have the monogamous family, you can't pass down private property. So first comes the family, then private property, then you create the conditions for a class that has accumulated property to desire the creation of a state to protect its property. So the first class struggle is that struggle against patriarchy that's rooted in the creation of the monogamous family. So that's a determinate form, a specific particular way that the class struggle occurs. It's not just as a lot of the Socialist Party people and early American so-called Marxists understood it in the U.S., just like a factory thing. It's not just that. It takes many. So take the book from Morris Hillquit that gets published on the history of socialism in the United States. It's published like 1910. It's a big 450-page book. I cited in that article, there's not one mention of the Civil War as a revolution waged by the Black proletariat that emancipated 4 million enslaved people. The biggest advancement in the history of your country's class struggles, and you don't talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
So what some on the more liberal academic left would call that is class reductionism. I turn that around. It's an inability to see those things as class struggles. It's an incorrect understanding of class, because the struggle of the Black freedom movement in the U.S. has been at the forefront of class struggles in the U.S. It's just like in other contexts, the national struggle for liberation has been at the forefront of their class struggles in colonial context, right? The Algerian struggle for independence took the form of an anti-colonial national struggle. So it's absurd to speak about class struggle when you see white workers fighting their bosses in the factory, but when you see whole peoples emancipating themselves, that's now something else. That's not a class struggle. Marx understood that the struggle of the Russian serfs, that the struggle of the Polish against Russian imperialism, that the struggles of the Irish against British imperialism, that the struggle of the Black proletariat here against the mode of production of capitalist slavery, he understood all of those as class struggle. He said that the most important and monumental victories of class struggles in the modern world were the emancipation of Black people from the US South and the emancipation of the Russian serf in Russia. So it is true. There is that tendency that ignores it. But that's the tendency we call the fake Marxists. Real Marxist analysis has always prioritized those struggles as class struggles as equally and sometimes more important than the other basic factory struggle.
Wow, that's a lot there. I wanted to get into. I won't do that today with my audience and mess them up with the France Fanon, because we had to study all this, the colonial struggles with um, the negritude philosophy, the movement. There's that intersection between Black political thought and philosophical thought with the larger global struggle. And I've always said on the forum that the blind spot of any of these stupid ass labels like progressives, lefties, and all this stuff is there just a lack of international consciousness. There's a lack of focus on international affairs in general, and everything cannot be U.S. centered. And to me, that's the largest blind spot. I can agree with a lot of my liberal friends on stuff, but it's like they don't have any clue about what's going on outside of the country. And to me, that affects all your political analysis. If you can't, if you know what's happening outside of the country, I mean, that's where most of the people are. That's where most of the population is. And so, as far as the Soviet Union is concerned, I wanted to bring this in because when I hear you guys talk a lot, and I follow your channel for sure, I followed it for a while. Um, and I should follow it more probably, but there's just like so much to do. There's so many people to look at and so much to read. I read more personally than watch YouTube channels. Like I read a lot of books, but as far as Marxism, Leninism, that's where I get lost. Like I pretend not to know it sometimes because I just don't want to get too hard into theory. But I hear Stalin not mentioned as much, or maybe I'm completely wrong. But when I talk to people about when this ever comes up about political science or political philosophies and theories, it seems like Stalinism is less emphasized than Marxism, Leninism. Is there a reason for that? Um, and is there a negative connotation associated with Stalinism versus Marxism, Leninism in comparison?
Do you want to go first, Carlos, or should I?
Sure, yeah, I'll address it because I think within the academy, there's two things that are being done. There's some forms of Marxism that are okay, right? The ones that, as you mentioned, do not criticize imperialism thoroughly, or if they criticize it, they always make it a both and thing. Yes, we must condemn so and so, but yeah, our empire is also bad. And that neutralizes, that attempts to place you at a neutral position on a moving train, as Howard Zinn used to say, and you can't have that. But you do have a small sector of Trotskyite academics within the Western academies that they continue to label themselves Marxist-Leninists. They continue to say that they're aligned with the tradition of Lenin as a actual advancement of Marxism, but that they condemn Stalinism. And as someone who does research in this field, it's virtually impossible to find a new book on Marxism printed in Western editorials that within the first 5 pages doesn't condemn Stalinism. The way I've described it in the past, it's like the Korean tradition of taking off your shoes before you go in the house. Before you can start the book, it doesn't matter if you're talking about commodity production, whatever you're talking about, you have to condemn Stalinism, right? Half of the things that they condemn is actual real socialist states in the past. So all that this so-called Stalinism is the form that the advancement of Marxism took in a state which was at its time the only socialist state in the world, where there were hundreds of thousands of Western spies trying to overthrow the revolution, where there was deep contradictions that were inherited from before the revolution and different factions of the Bolsheviks that were rooted in a culture uh, that precedes the revolution, it precedes the small period of liberal democracy in Russia, a czarist culture that, the way that you engage with opponents is by calling them traitors and treasonous to the revolutions and agents of a foreign government. And if you have political power, you get rid of them. And it was a deeply contradict. They have the same things that we see today happening against Cuba, blockades, all these different forms of hybrid warfare against the Soviet Union when it was alone in the world. And so this produces the period of Stalin's leadership, specifically in the 30s and the 40s and the post-war period, where there are, in the 30s, certain forms of repression and purges. And what those are called by that period ends up being labeled as Stalinism by the Trotskyites in order to divorce it from the good old Marxism, Leninism. I think that's a big mistake. I think that even though today we can say with a certain sense of certainty that conditions will never be such that people whom we disagree with in the party we would have to get rid of. You know, we can say that with certainty that the actions of Stalin we would never have to replicate. We can't say and speak from this moral high ground and say that in the middle of you preparing yourself to fight Nazi invasions, which they knew were coming from the early 30s, when you got cats running around in the party trying to overthrow it, promoting terrorism, they killed Kirov, you know, various leaders in the party that aligned themselves with Stalin. When you got that going on, what do? What would the US do to people within the ruling party uh, promoting terrorist acts in order to overthrow the government? You know, we can condemn it. We could say we have to live up to a higher sense of morality as communists, et cetera, et cetera. But um, when we contextualize it, it makes a lot more sense. And it's harder to reduce it to, oh, there was just this paranoid maniac named Stalin and he created this thing called Stalinism almost arbitrarily. No, there was objective conditions that produced it. There's things that could be criticized. But Stalinism is just the Marxist-Leninist experiment, which Marxism-Leninism, it really is just Marxism in the age of imperialism, in the age where capitalism monopolizes, where finance capital becomes the dominant force of capital. It's no longer industrial capital, it's finance capital. And when there's this deep struggle between the imperialist powers for the repartition of the global South, of the colonial loot. And that's the age of Marxism, that when revolution can actually be put on the table and was put on the table and was successful in many different contexts. So I still think that Marxism is still in that stage where it needs to be Marxism-Leninism in order to be adapted to the conditions today, not just of imperialism, but of neo-imperialism, because we've had a new development, a new partially qualitative leap after the end of the Second World War with the development of the World Bank, the IMF. This level of globalized financial capital did not exist in Lenin's time, but it intensifies the things that Lenin was already analyzing. So Marxism-Leninism for us is just Marxism today. Marxism that is applying the method, the dialectical materialist method, to our current reality.
Yeah, let me just add real quick. There is this distortion, and there are a million distortions about Marxism in our era. And there's a reason for that. But there is this distortion that Marxism is somehow this fully laid out prescriptive idea where we are going to do X, Y, and Z. And if you want to do A, B, and C, you're a Stalinist. If you want to do D, E, and F, you're a Leninist. If you want to do, you know, L, W, and 3, you're a Trotskyist. But that's not how Marxism has ever been viewed by any Marxist. Marxism is instead a way of understanding everything in the world according to its material basis, which is always in motion, right? And we apply that view to Marxism itself. So as society moves forward into the era of imperialism, we need to continue updating the way we see it based on what's changed. And that's why we add Marxism-Leninism. And that's just like the official name of Marxism since then, right? And maybe it's time for something new, because something new really is emerging in our era. This higher stage of imperialism that we're in right now seems to be leading us somewhere else. And one of the outcomes of it, one of the proudest things I've ever done in my life has been editing Carlos's book on the purity fetish, because the purity fetish takes this new form in this more advanced era of imperialism, right? But that's not the only thing. We had the rise of the middle classes in Lenin's era, right? And today we have the death of those middle classes, or what our institute calls reproletarianization, all these people who lost the proletarian character of what they were that gave them this revolutionary potential. They lost it when they gained this stability and were able to accumulate wealth of their own. But that's all gone now, right? They're re-proletarianizing. The difference is the way we do production is different. It's all globalized now. It's all fully financialized. The primary mode of profit making is no longer even the direct sale of commodities. Sales of commodities are instead done in the service of speculation and stock pricing. Mm-hmm. And so that creates new relations of production, because one of the basic tenets of Marxism really is that all of our social relations are class contradictions, are reflections of the way we go about producing all of the things that make society society, right? Our food, our everything. And that has changed, you know? So that's, you know, my rambling, what Marxism, Leninism is thing.
No, it's crazy what both of you guys discussed, because when Carlos mentioned the period that people focus on, the Trotsky people, about Stalinism, it reminds me a lot, honestly. Like I said, I studied Cuba, and I'm not necessarily the most versed in the Cuban Revolution. I've read lots of novels that dealt with the Cuban Revolution, so my interpretation of Cuba is through literature. But even then, I have an understanding through the literature of Cuba. And I know that when the revolution first started in Cuba, it wasn't the same as it was in the 80s. And you can't look at it from just the same stage. It's going to be that way all throughout the revolution. I mean, of course, people like to refer to the 60s period, the repression of gay people, the repression of the writers, the repression of all these people who are outside of the norm of the revolution, you know. And I know Carlos is familiar with this, and you probably are too, Noah. But that's one part of the revolution. I mean, everything has to make adjustments based on the circumstances, because like you were saying before, Stalin, there were so many attacks towards the Soviet Union from the outside, and the same with Cuba. I mean, hell, the United States, I mean, the failed Bay of Pigs, all types of stuff. I mean, you still have the blockade that's been going on for over 60 years now. So it makes sense how history, I am understanding more through this conversation and similar types of conversations, that maybe these things aren't as distant as they seem. Even though we think of the 1917 Russian Revolution, yeah, that happened 100 years ago, but maybe it's not as distant as it seems. And I've had to learn that, because I keep asking people, why do we keep referring to the Communist Manifesto? Why do we keep referring to things that were published so far back? And now I start to think, well, damn, he's quoting DuBois and he's quoting this and that, and he's making it relate to where we are now. So it also has a place in time now, and we can't just discredit it for being a relic of the past. And so that's what I'm learning, and maybe that's where the theory is super important. Even though I claim not to be into the theory, this is making me definitely more interested, because I can see the context and how it affects things now. And that's what I'm about. I'm really about, okay, how does this affect people now? And I think if people are learning it this way, the way we're teaching it and the way we're explaining it, I think more people will come on board, and they don't see it as some kind of a relic in the past.
Absolutely.
I couldn't
That's so
agree more.
important to know.
Unfortunately, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah,
I have
ahead.
to go. I'm at my hard out time. I apologize. But before I go, I want to say that there's a reason that we're told constantly to focus on the early homophobia in the Cuban Revolution, right? There is a reason that we're constantly told that Stalin, ate everybody's baby and their baby's baby. Because what it does is prevents people from looking into the facts for themselves. If they have a reason to dismiss it, they never will. And then they're lured away from the science of human liberation, right? From what we should be teaching ourselves in order to overcome the problems of our current day. And there's been a concerted effort by our ruling class to, in various ways, get us to dismiss this for decades. That's the last thing I'll say. I really do have to get back to work. I'm so sorry I can't stay a little longer. This has been great. Thank you so much for having me on, brother. I can't wait to do this again.
Hey, I can't wait to have you back on. This has been so impactful, even though we're 45 minutes in, but I feel like it's going to make a lot of connections with people, and that's the point. But Noah Khrachvik, it was nice having you on from the Midwestern Marx Institute. And if I'm not mistaken, you're one of the co-founders. I'm not sure. Or maybe you came on board later. I'm not sure. I don't want to mess up the words, but we're just
I came on board later, but I came on board later, but I'm one of the co-directors.
Okay, cool. Okay, I know it was something. But anyway, enjoy your day, and we will talk soon, okay?
You too, brother.
Thank
Take
you,
care.
Noah.
Thanks
Talk to you later.
Yep.
So, Kiko, one of the things that I wanted to say to that last point you made, which is very good, socialism has it's still even 100 years deep. It's in a very embryonic stage. You still listen to how the Chinese talk about their socialist civilization. They're speaking of it as if you're talking about a toddler. You know, if you bring it to the level of like a human life. And from the moment that socialism was in its incubator, the socialist baby was in its incubator, they've been trying to kill it. They've been trying to strangle it. And I often paint this analogy where if you get a swimmer, you tie his hands around, you tie his feet, um, you cover his nose or something, and you throw him in the pool. If that dude survives, it's impressive, right? You know, and the audacity one has to have to criticize his strokes is ridiculous. And that's what a lot of the Western left has done with socialism, where they ignore the tremendous external and internal pressures that socialism has been forced to be constructed in a world still dominated by capitalist imperialism. And then whenever it doesn't meet the perfect ideas of what they think socialism ought to be, they condemn it. And that phenomenon, which it's systematic here in Western so-called Marxist analysis, that's what I call the purity fetish. Because they fetishize this pure idea of what the world ought to be like and ignore all of the contradictions that are actually shaping the world and that make it so that that idea can never be actually fully realized within our current conditions. And it's an absence of what Marxism actually is. Marxism is not the set of conclusions that we get from the classics that we then uh, treat religiously as the dogma that we're going to live by. Marxism is a method. It's a philosophy. It's a worldview. In German, Weltanschauung. It's a way of us approaching the world in a way that's informed by the things that we discover in approaching the world. And the basis of that worldview, I think a lot of it has already been accepted as common sense by most of us. It's just that we don't tend to reflect on our worldview. So we might have this little bit of common sense that's within the dialectical materialist tradition, but we got this other one. And we don't notice how having both is a contradiction. But the basis of the worldview is just that everything is in a constant state of flux, in constant movement. And most people tend to accept that, not just concerning human life, but concerning nature as well. Everything is constantly changing. That's not new to Marxism. That goes back to Heraclitus and the tradition of ancient Greek philosophy. Everything is pregnant with contradictions, which might be a little hard for people to wrap their heads around. But what it fundamentally means is that the things and the processes that we see in the world are not these homogeneous entities. They're not just this unity or this uniformity that's composed of nothing but one substance. Things are composed of opposing forces, opposing tendencies that are in relations with other opposing tendencies. So take the example of a society. We have within the capitalist social totality, we have a force called the proletariat and a force called the bourgeoisie, the workers and the capitalists. The interest of one is fundamentally antagonistic to the interest of another. So what does that mean? That this totality is pregnant with a contradiction. And it is that struggle that working people are engaged with their bosses that produces social change and social transformations.
Mm-hmm.
And that's change, transformation, and look at things from the standpoint of the whole. So if you get to a boxing match and you only watch the 12th round, is anyone gonna respect your judgment for the whole fight? No, because it's very clear that in order to understand the fight, you have to see the whole thing. You have to see the 12th round in light of the previous 11, and you have to see if you saw the first round, you have to see it in light of what it unfolds to in the other 11 rounds. So you have to see things from the standpoint of the totality. That's all the Marxist worldview is, and it is, I think, something that is very commonsensical. You have this tradition in the Western Academy that loves complicating stuff, that writes for the sake of impact factor journals, university editorials, etc., and and doesn't write for the people. So they have the luxury of making things sound extremely difficult when in reality it's very commonsensical. And that's one of the things where I think we break very radically from Western Marxist scholarship. Yes, we do try to have as high a scholarly standard as possible, but we want to educate the people. Our Marxism is not just trying to understand the world, but it's trying to change it. And you can't change it without being rooted in the masses,
Hmm.
without helping them have some clarity as to what the fuck is going on in their hectic lives, and using that to understand how to move forward and change society into one that's more humane, more democratic, and freer for the vast majority of humanity. So that the goods that we produce, the abundance that we produce, is not just enjoyed by a small group of people, but it's enjoyed by everyone, so that we can work less and have more time to be creative and produce the things that we want to produce, podcast, or do artistic work, write, do these other things that we're limited in doing because of the constraints that we have within the current society that we live in.
You said something there that I thought was noteworthy. I mean, everything that you said there was wonderful, but a noteworthy part when you referred to and I think even when Noah was on, when we discussed the nascency of socialism, what we call socialism, I think it goes perfectly into the chapter where you talk about China and the Western Marxist, I guess the fake analysis and interpretation of China. You're saying yourself in this conversation that even China is trying to understand its socialistic characteristics. So how can someone from the outside interpret a country like China when that country hasn't said, "Hey, this is what it is"? I mean, so what exactly are they referring to? Because I always hear this in history, all these failed socialistic experiments, and based on what you said, I mean, there hasn't been like an actual pure socialism, or there hasn't been a developed socialism, because the one that we refer to now, which would be, I guess, China, would be the closest country in the world to whatever that is. It's still in its nascency. So how is it that those people even know what they're talking about?
Right, right. The plan that they have for 2049, which would be the centenary of the creation of the PRC, they want to by that time be a modernized socialist ecological civilization. So if it's already embedded in how they speak about themselves that they're in a very early stage in the process of developing socialism. The way that people who are critical of these projects speak is in various ways. One of them, we have to understand that think tanks and institutions in the West are not these neutral institutions just trying to understand the world and be truthful. They serve certain class interests. And just as there was with the case of the Soviet Union, where there were a bunch of institutions in leading universities, Harvard, and others, where their whole point was to study Russia from the analysis of the West and from the standpoint of the interests of our ruling class, and distort certain things and interpret certain things unfaithfully, right? If they don't have the same form of electoral politics that we have, they're by definition undemocratic or something like that, without interpreting what does democracy actually means, what type of form does it take over there. They do the same thing with China. They do the same thing with Cuba. They do the same thing with every country that exists outside of the sphere of influence of US imperialism. The thing is that it's also found in the left, in the sort of Marxists that are allowed within the Western Academy. And the critique that these people have of states like China, and I'll focus in on China here, um, are different from these other critiques, but they hold some of the same assumptions. Um, some of the times you hear them talk about, the Uyghur genocide or something, Where it's like, well, where's the evidence for that? Why are you just trusting your ruling class, who you know lied to you about Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? You know, imagine trusting a partner that's been lying to you for 70 years or longer, and then something new pops up, and then you trust them. You just instinctually trust them. That's what a lot of Western Marxists, that's what their engagement is with the U.S. state when it comes to them talking about other countries. So they trust a lot of those things. And then there's another group within those Western Marxists that what they do is they judge these socialist societies on the basis of whether they measure up to what they think socialism is. In their head, socialism is a society without markets that is fully centrally planned, where there's no exploitation, where there's no classes, where there's some of them take it even deeper and they talk about socialism or communism as a society without money, without a state, et cetera, et cetera. Some of them are more mature and they understand that's long-term view communism. None of us think we're ever going to see it, but still socialism is supposed to look like so and so. But the mistake there, again, is the inability to root their analysis in actual concrete reality. The basis of Marxism is analyzing the concrete situation concretely. And so when you have a country like China that was systematically underdeveloped as a country that was colonialized, like most of the global South, what are the things that they need in order to survive the attacks from imperialism? Well, they're enumerated by Zhao and Lai in the 70s. And they repeat a lot of the themes that Lenin had mentioned uh, during the period of war communism that was partially the reason for the transition to the new economic policy in the early 20s. What do they need? Well, they need to develop the productive forces. They need to be able to produce more so that they can actually raise the living standards of their people. They need to develop the sciences and technology, which is essential in combating neocolonialism, right? Part of the essence of neocolonialism is sustaining the global South in a state of dependency where all they produce is low-tech goods. So you develop the sciences and technologies. You develop your agriculture and you develop your securities. Right now, Iran, we just had a guest on the other day. Iran has had to focus on developing their defense technologies and their securities because they send a tanker of oil to Venezuela and it just gets hijacked by American pirates who take it to ExxonMobil in Texas. So how do you prevent those attacks? Well, you develop these four central areas. You develop yourself. And that's what China's focus has been. And it worked for a period of time from 49 to 78, which was 78 is when reform and opening up takes place. In that period of time, you have the Great Leap Forward for a couple of years, which is a big mistake. It's the area that most people in the West point at and look at, Mao killed X amount of millions of people. The reality was that, yes, a lot of people died. It was, I think, a theoretical mistake that led to practical uh, uh, devastation. There was millions of people that died. But when you look at the rates of deaths and you compare China to India, which is always a good comparison, in that Great Leap Forward period, the rate of deaths was the same. And when you look at other countries in the global South, it was the same. Because the rate of death was the normal rate of death of colonized countries because of the poverty that they were forced into. So all that happened was that they had been able to improve in the 5 years that they had gotten power from 49 to, I think, 54, so much that when the Great Leap Forward fails and they go back to where they were before that, which is where every other colonized country was, it's such a drastic distinction because of that progress. But what happens within a couple of years, they admit, okay, we fucked up. Let's take another strategy. Eventually, the Cultural Revolution comes about, and that has its own contradictions. That has its very deep mistakes. You have the Sino-Soviet split. A lot of these events that I think we have learned from, but that were catastrophic to the global communist movement. But if you take it as a whole, the period from 49 to 78, the increase in life expectancy that you see in China, 32 years over a span of 29 years, if I recall correctly, is higher than you have ever seen in the history of humanity. So in terms of the raising of the living standards, the raising of life expectancy, it was unmatched in human history. The previous era of such development was the Stalin period of collectivization, right? So the two times at that moment in history where humanity had leaped forward the most as humanity, not just as a ruling class that gets richer and richer, was first Stalin's USSR, then China. And then you have the period of post 78, where that growth explodes. And what happens in 78 with reform and opening up? It's not that Deng wakes up one day and says, let's just let capital flow in. And no, they're blocked from the world. And they try it out first in a few provinces where they let capitalist enterprises come in and they see if it helps develop China. China had made that growth, but it was still poorer than most African countries. So they they decide to open up to let capital flow in and to control that capital, to ride the tiger. That's a famous image that they use. They wanted to ride the tiger. So the tiger's dangerous, but if you learn how to ride it, you can succeed. And what happens is that there's this distinction that Mao had already made in 54 that becomes central between economic capital and political capital. And what the Chinese said is, yes, it's evident ever since Marx that the wrestling, so the removing of the capitalist's property is something that happens by degree. If they're allowing us to develop the productive forces and they can be controlled such that the increase in capital helps humanity in our countries, we'll leave them there. But what they cannot get even the smallest bit of is political capital. The state and its institutions, which are the ones that will govern the economy, need to be controlled by the Communist Party. What is the Communist Party? Well, the party of the people and the peasants in China. In Cuba, this takes the form of a famous Fidel phrase, dentro de la revolución todo, fuera de la revolución nada. Within the revolution, everything, outside of the revolution, nothing. So in Cuba, you have a plurality of views, but what you cannot have is a cat talking about, we need capitalism, we need to overthrow the revolution. You cannot have that. Just like you wouldn't have been able to have that in the US in the post-revolutionary period, right? So China, by developing the Communist Party, allowing capital to come in and forcing it, to this day, capitalist enterprises, they need to have a certain amount of Communist Party members within it to ensure that capital accumulation and growth for the company reflects itself in the raising of living standards for working people. So it's turning everything on its head. In the US, capital accumulates in such a form where it is the end of everything. The whole telos, the goal of everything is the accumulation of capital, and it is the state, the people, and society that is put at the service of accumulating capital in a small group of hands. In China, because of the control of the Communist Party, it is this expansion in capital that is put at the service of bettering society. And the proof is in the pudding. The proof is there. More than 800 million people lifted out of poverty, something unheard of. The living standards today, I mean, you look at level 7 cities in China, and they make the best cities in the US look like shit.
I know.
Look at the trains. Look at Chinese trains in low-rated cities and compare it to fucking New York. It's an embarrassment for us. Look at the high-speed rail. They have trains that go as fast as planes. I have a Chinese colleague here in the philosophy department. He was telling me he has to take a trip now to Chicago. It takes 6 hours. In 6 hours, they would be able to take a train from Shanghai to Beijing, whose distance would be 2-3 times as much as from Carbondale to Chicago. So the amount of public infrastructure for public transportation, the development of new cities, it's proven what a society can do when the governing structure, the state institutions, the social institutions are controlled by a people's party. Yes, there is capital. Yes, there is exploitation. Yes, there are billionaires. Yes, of course. That doesn't mean it's not socialism or it's not in a process of constructing socialism. And that's where the Western Marxists, specifically on what we would call the ultra left or the Maoist tendencies, that's where they get it wrong. It doesn't look like this fully centralized, no market, no money, so therefore it's not communism, it's not socialism. No, it's in a very early stage. It recognizes itself in a very, very early stage. It has a capacity that we don't have here because we put in a new president every 4 years, of having long-term plans. As I mentioned, they have a plan for 2049, and they've had that for decades. So, how does where in whose hands, in whose control are the central industries in China, steel and other, in the control of state companies, controlled by the state, by the people's state. What is the center of the economy? It's planned. It's centrally planned. And market forces and capitalist companies, they play an auxiliary role to the centrally planned and the centrally planned and state-controlled economy. So yes, it exists, but it exists in a way that's mediated, they obtain their meaning on the basis of the central mode of production, the principal mode of production. And that word auxiliary is important, right? It appears in Plato's Republic. What's the auxiliary class? What's that class of warriors whose sole purpose of existence is serving the guardians, the philosopher leaders, the intellectual workers. That's how the markets and private property functions in China. Its sole purpose, unlike it is in the US and in the capitalist countries, is to serve the people, to serve the development of socialism. And that's not something that the Chinese just invented. They've given it a specific Chinese characteristic, but Lenin emphasized that in the new economic policy. And when he did, all of the same ultra leftist forces did the same thing that they do now to China, which is you're a capitalist roader, you're betraying the revolution, you're going down the capitalist road. That's why they call them capitalist roaders. You're going down the capitalist road. But Lenin said, we cannot build socialism in a country that's poor. We need to develop. We need technicians. We need professionals who have these skills so that they allow us to run a more successful society. We can talk about the ideals of socialism all we want, but that doesn't feed people. We need to create a better society than the one that they had before. So that's what I think China has done extremely successfully to the point uh, where they've gotten to a stage that the Soviet Union never got, which is that today the whole global economy is dependent on China. So they have the power globally that the USSR never had, and they don't that power is not used hegemonically as the US uses it. They want win-win relations in international at the international scale, which is why the whole world is turning towards them. Instead of taking out loans from the IMF or the World Bank or trading with the US, it's fully unilateral. They trade with China. And what does China promote? Not this process of debt trapping, where most of the loans that you're given is to pay back more debt, and you're forced to privatize your economy, to liberalize, to promote austerity for the people, and to deregulate everything so that Western companies can come in and just exploit and expropriate your resources. China's trades with the global South develop infrastructure. The whole Shanghai Cooperation Bank, that's the basis of it. And it's something that the New Development Bank, now ran by Dilma Rousseff of the New Development Bank of the BRICS, the only conditionality is that there's no conditionality. So we're not going to impose neoliberalism on you if you take out a loan. So I guess that would be the only conditionality, that you use these loans to develop your infrastructure, develop your state so that you can serve your people. And so that's why, and to sit here today, as many of these Western socialists do, and just critique China, some on the basis of ridiculous bourgeois assumptions, others on the basis of the purity fetish, it doesn't line up to my pure idea of socialism, so I'm going to condemn it, is absurd. You look foolish. Most people that go as neutral observers to China end up staying. There's countless vlogs of people from the West who show up in China and they're like, oh my God, with the salary that I make and how cheap living is here, I can actually pay back my student loans.
Mm-hmm.
There's an influx of students from the US going to China because it's the only fucking place where they'll be able to get the sort of job that allows them to pay off their student loans.
Mm-hmm.
So China's not a paradise. It's got its own contradictions and its imperfections, and they're conscious of it, which is another thing that we don't have here in the West. You know, we continue to speak of ourselves as the most perfect democratic human rights, all this bullshit. But it's a tremendous hope, I think, not just for socialists, but for humanity in general.
Do you have time for two more questions, Carlos?
Yes, 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 of course.
Okay. One thing that's really concerning to me is and here we go again talking about how history repeats itself, or how these different periods really aren't that distant. And I think about just the McCarthy era in the United States. It seems like, honestly, that we have a new version of that going on now with the condemnation of journalists, the condemnation of, honestly, people who find themselves outside of the confines of the mainstream media, outside of the confines of legacy media, academia, anything like this. Like, we're both in academia. Like, I'm technically academia, I guess, on paper, but I don't have anything to do with academia right now per se. If you consider this academia like, I mean, sure. I thought it was interesting. I was at the coffee shop a couple of weeks ago, and the lady said, "Well, you know what? You are teaching though. If you have your own podcast and you're not in a classroom, you're just doing it on a YouTube channel." I was like, you know what? I didn't even think about it like that myself. Like I thought it was kind of cool that a stranger who had never interacted with my channel made a comment like that and made me sort of reconfigure. Okay, maybe this is like the classroom. Maybe this is the new classroom approach to people like ourselves who may not be welcome in the brick and mortar type universities, because I see a lot of that going on. They're ousting people that have views about Palestine and Israel. Like if it's not the state media version, they're going to get you out. I mean, Cornel West had to deal with this. Finkelstein had to deal with this. I mean, there's a tradition of this. I think of people like yourselves, and I see this label thrown on people like Radhika Desai, on S.L. Canton, on people like yourself in the Midwestern Marx Institute. If you have any sort of analysis that presents China, Russia, or any country that the US doesn't like in not even a positive light, but just like a neutral sort of a stance, just like you just reporting about China or Russia or anything, you're automatically tagged as a CCP puppet, a Russian apologist. And I'm just like, how the fuck is that even possible? And then they completely trashed like Russia Today. And I don't understand it. And it seems like anyone that's outside of that, you're basically a spy. It would be like we would be the spies during the McCarthy era. We would be the people, the undesirables. We would be the people where the FBI knocks at that door. How do we combat these types of powerful narratives directed at people like us, just like everyday citizens? What can we do in our part to combat those types of powerful forces against us?
Thank you. That's a great question. The part there where you were talking about the reaction of people to folks that are, sometimes neutral. Like I'm explicit that I'm not neutral. I support China because I'm a communist, but there's a lot of folks that are neutral and still get labeled CCP puppets. It reminds me of this one old Soviet joke where there's a Soviet scholar and an American one on a plane together, and the American asks the Soviet scholar, what are you doing in your trip to America? He's like, well, I'm coming here to study propaganda. He's like, what do you mean propaganda? He's like, exactly. You know, we're the most propagandized because a lot of us don't see it as propaganda. We're just the slaves looking at the shadows on the cave, and that's our reality. We don't know that there's cats in the back with the fire and the statues that are creating the shadows, and we're even farther from knowing the fact that the statues are based on real shit outside. So we're so disconnected from reality. We're in this little insular thing that they have created for us. A reality has been invented so that we consent to their thing. There's this dialectic between the Michael Parenti inventing reality, invent reality, so that, as Chomsky says, they can manufacture consent. But I think the question you ask is extremely important, and McCarthyism is intensifying. You can argue that it never left. It's just the forces of dissent uh, weren't they fell after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Most people just joined the Democratic Party in the
Mhm.
US, and in Europe they just joined whatever social democratic party was in the country that they existed in. A bunch of communist parties collapsed and became, if they survived, indistinguishable from the regular left liberal parties. What you have today is something very different from previous Red Scares, whether it's the one that occurred during the First World War, towards the end of it, or whether it's the McCarthy Red Scare. In those times, it was the minority of people in the U.S. that were showing solidarity and that were fighting for peace, and that were the Reds. The Reds were a minority. Okay. Today, you have a situation where if you look at what they're saying, they're going to combat uh, people who are sympathetic to Palestine in college campuses. Well, let's look at the statistics. How many people 18 to 35 support Palestine? It's around 70 something, 80%.
It's
That's the
crazy.
age group that's in college. So, what the fuck are you saying? You're saying you're going to suppress 80% of college students because they got the kafaya on and they support Palestine and they're against the fucking genocide funded by their government, and have their fucking tax dollars while their cities are crumbling used to kill babies? More than 9,000, almost 10,000 now babies killed. It's absurd. So it's not going to work. They're going to repress us, but it's not going to work simply because they've lost it. They've lost the information war. As we were talking earlier, the Trump people, the Bernie people, people are dissenting to the establishment. People are descending to the establishment. There's a disconnect. There's a crisis of legitimacy. This is what it's called in political science. People are not consenting to the existing order anywhere near the rates at which they did it in the past. In no state, regardless of how fascistic, can survive only on the basis of coercion. Every state needs consent. And we're getting to the point where on key issues, whether it's Ukraine, the proxy war against Russia, whether it's the genocidal war against the Palestinians, or even the war against China, the vast majority of the American people do not consent to these activities. And when they see the repression cracking down on folks, it's very easy to tell them, how do you support free speech, but you don't let these people speak out against genocide? How do you support uh, free media, but you allow the censorship of outlets that are that have counter narratives to the narrative of the elite? So it's so much easier today to bring people on board, partly because their material conditions are worse. The McCarthyite period came in when that middle class was at its peak, right? So when you got everything good, you can look away. But when you don't know how you're going to pay for the things at the end of the month to survive, and you see these motherfuckers sending $4 billion to kill babies, you're going to make that connection between your condition at home and what they're doing abroad. And when you see people fighting against that, you're going to see, oh, those people are fighting for me. Because the fight that the Palestinians are waging against the Israeli imperialist powers, which is just a proxy of the US in the Middle East, they're not fighting just for themselves, they're fighting for all of us. In the fact that they're fighting against imperialism, they're fighting against our ruling class. And that puts them on our side. We got the same interest. The Palestinians' plight is not just the Palestinians, it's our plight as well. Because it is our tax dollars that go to bomb them. It is our republic that is being drained. Our republic that has all of our cities crumbling. People looking like zombies in some of the major cities that were industrial powerhouses 5 decades ago because of the addiction to drugs that was promoted by the medical pharmaceutical industrial complex in cahoots with the government, doctors, universities, NGOs, etc. While that goes on at home, you do that over there. So these material conditions make it so that people end up dissenting at higher rates than ever before. They cannot look away anymore because their meat is on the line, their skin is on the line, and they can't improve our material conditions because that would require redeveloping the country, a new process of perhaps green industrialization or industrialization in general. And the capitalists cannot do that because they won't get the same rates of profit as before. That's the reason they went abroad. That's why they took the factories abroad, so that they could pay workers a fraction of what they pay American workers. And that's the reason why the ones that didn't do that, they went towards the route of financialization, the most parasitic form of accumulating capital. So the thing that they need in order to improve our material conditions and get us to be in a state where we can look away, it's impossible for them to accomplish because of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, which is something that you can prove with statistics. So we are at a what would be called in the Marxist jargon a nodal point in history. We're at that point where shit has accumulated so much where we're about to hit a point where something qualitative happens, right? You can take water down to I think it's 32 degrees, and it goes from liquid, and then one more degree, it changes. It undergoes a qualitative leap, and it turns to ice. It turns to a solid. We are around that era. Those are the moments where Lenin used to say that there's decades where nothing happens, and weeks where decades happen. I think we're around the area where we might encounter weeks where decades happen.
That's a lot that you could take that last statement you made, but I tell you, some of that what you described sounds a lot like Radhika Desai's book. We had Radhika on a few months ago. She's going to be back on this month. Her newest book, Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War. Yes,
I endorsed it. I was one of the endorsers of the book.
absolutely. Yes, definitely. And I thought that was wonderful because not really knowing that you all had a connection, I was like, wow, that's so crazy how they ended up working out. And this is me, honestly, just like I read books all the time and I get things that come across the board and I'm just like, hey, that seems interesting. That seems interesting. And then recommendations from the audience too. I really got to say thanks to Jay Carrico because Jay Carrico sent a whole list. Tico, you're a great person to interview people. You need to interview these people. I know you're going to take the time to read their content, so you should reach out to these people. So shout out to Jay Carrico for being one of the most dedicated listeners. Jay's been on the forum 4 or 5 different times, I think. And I think Jay's also taking classes with Midwestern Marx Institute as
Mm.
well. So shout out to Jay. Um, there's one big question I had before we end today. I hate for this to end, but I got places to go. Got to pick up my son soon, and I know you probably have other engagements as well. But you talked about 3 blind spot areas. Really, honestly, the purity fetish touches on a lot of the blind spots of these people, these misguided leftists or whatever they are, these Western Marxists. But the 3 main points that there are 3 rejections that don't make sense to these people. They reject the actual existence of socialism, you said, the rejection of backwards workers, and the rejection of the national past. When I hear backwards workers, we've talked about that some on the forum. Is that referring only to the workers, or what do we mean when we say backwards exactly? And how is that interpreted now? Because I have, I guess, questions about the terminology, issues with it, because who created that term backwards?
Yeah, it's one that we have used in the Marxist tradition for a while to refer to the part of the working class that doesn't um, that isn't immediately seeing how it is that they have an interest as a class. So it used to be that you would call the backwards workers the people that were rooted in very narrow craft interests, right? So this idea of even the working class organizing beyond just a specific craft that you're in is relatively new. One of the people that bring forth the idea of one big union is the IWW in the US, and it's called industrial unionism, because before that you had craft unionism. And
Mm-hmm.
the tradition develops of calling anyone that doesn't see the interest of their class as a working person backwards. So it's not like in other, so the idea has been that a lot of people on the left, in the US left, communists, they have accepted the dogma of Trump working people, of the MAGA working class base, as a basket of deplorables. And what is that Comrade Hillary quote of the basket of deplorables, if not what would get translated into the Marxist tradition as the backward part of the working class? And so the whole tradition has always said that you cannot ignore those sectors of the working class. You have to go and still talk to them and show them these connections and why it is in their interest to engage in these fights. The way that racism was combated in the U.S. South was not by telling the racist white workers in specific unions, like, we don't want to work with you. It was by going and telling them, why are you being so fucking stupid? Don't you see that the interest that you have and the interest of the black worker is the same, and that it's the boss pitting you against him? So you, through class struggle, you help them come out of whatever backwardness that they have. And that backwardness is always a result of the ideas of bourgeois society that are rooted when it comes to working people in the necessity of the ruling class to divide us. They need to divide us. And so that the form that that takes with the purity fetish and the way that I see that specific one is that these people think that the Trump base and other parts of conservative workers are not enlightened enough, specifically on certain social issues. And I think here perhaps the LGBTQ issues come to the forefront. And because they're not enlightened enough in those areas, they're cancelable. We can ignore them. They're a basket of deplorables. They're the backward workers that we can ignore. Problem is that's 40 to 50% of the fucking working class. So
Mm-hmm.
if you have this pure standard of enlightenment that workers must live up to before you can organize, you end up in a position where the only people you're talking to are the choir. You're just preaching to the choir. You have to convince people. The struggle for socialism is a process of convincing people. The Gramsci used to describe it as a struggle for working class hegemony. That means the spread of the ideas of the socialist movement across people. You do that by consent. You don't beat it into people's heads. So you got to go talk to people. You got to be flexible. You know, you can't talk to someone in New York the same way that you talk to someone in Tennessee, or the same way that you talk to someone in Iowa. You have to understand, well, what are the common sense assumptions that they have? And on the basis of those assumptions, how can I pick out the rational kernels, the stuff that in their thinking already gets them connected to socialism
Mm-hmm.
and work myself towards that. But you don't have that in the left because you have the purity fetish, right? They don't live up to this pure idea, so we reject it. And it's one more form of that outlook. The other form, we talked already, socialism. If socialist countries don't live up to the pure idea of socialism, we condemn them. And that's absurd in our circumstance because McCarthyism is so deeply rooted in our societies that what some of the first questions when you go to organized workers is, well, what about this shit that they told me that socialism killed 100 million people and that it leads to poverty? And so if you accept the assumptions and the lies of the ruling class, if you accept their myths, who the hell are you going to convince? Your argument has to look something like, well, yeah, socialism has always failed, but we, the virtuous West, we're the ones that are going to get it right. We, the virtuous, exceptional Americans, we're going to get it right this time. The person talking to you has to be, as dumb as yourself to accept that, you know? So it's much more powerful. You could be like, look, this is the context that socialism was developed in. Here's what it was able to accomplish. Like this whole thing that we were just talking about what China accomplished and what the Soviet Union accomplished. You tell that to working people and you tell them, well, that was done under the boot of imperialist hybrid warfare. Imagine what we could do. Because socialism for us would mean the destruction of US imperialism. So we wouldn't have any of those pressures. We'd be able to develop it freely, relatively freely at least. Um, again, that's another form of the purity fetish. And the last one is the national past. I've seen it from the time that I got into politics. People going out there burning the flag in protest. People talking about socialism as the abolition of America. What they're doing is literally just reiterating the McCarthyite myths. That's
Oh,
what McCarthyism did. Socialism is anti-American. It was literally called the House of Un-American Activities. And these cats want to talk about socialism as the abolition of America. It's taking the gun that the McCarthyites were pointing at communists. You take it from them and you point it at yourself. It's the stupidest fucking thing you could do, especially when we live in a country where we've had people trying to understand the capitalist system systematically and understand how socialism can arise out of it from the 1830s. That's part of my research into the history of American socialism. 20, 30 years before Marx and Engels ever, quote unquote, developed scientific socialism, we already had people doing it here.
mm,
We were the people that developed the utopian communist communities that Engels and Marx learned from and critique in order to develop utopian socialism. Where was New Harmony? Where were the Owenite communities, the Fourierist communities, Saint Simon's followers? They were in the US. What
mm,
country produced a revolution such as the Civil War that was led by a general strike of the black proletariat? It was the US. If you were standing at the turn of the 20th century and you had to bet money for what country would achieve socialism first, you would be not very smart to not vote for the US because we had such a developed movement. We had strong populist left-wing movements, strong socialist movements, strong anarchist movements, different forms of more Marxian socialist. So we have a very rich socialist history. Some of the best things that people still enjoy were won by the struggles of working class militancy that was led by communists.
mm-hmm.
So if you approach the understanding of socialism that you bring to your people as something that's embedded in your history, it's a lot more powerful than if you say, we're just going to abolish America. No one's going to let you into their house if you tell them, we want a movement to abolish everything that you have come to love and the people that raised you and these traditions. It's absurd. And when you take it to the level of theory, you understand that just like there's no pure class struggle always takes determinate forms, the universal that exists only in the particular, the same thing with socialism. There's no such thing as pure socialism. It always ends up taking the characteristics, the particular forms of the people that waged and won the struggle for political power. So you have socialism with Chinese characteristics, you have Bolivarian socialism in Venezuela, you have a socialism deeply rooted in the Mambises and in Martí in Cuba. And what do you
Mm-hmm.
think the US is gonna look like? When you reject that tradition, you're making an argument for a liberal tinted exceptionalism. Yes, everyone has had to construct socialism on the basis of the history of their civilizations and their peoples, but no, we can do socialism on the basis of a blank slate. Ignore the progressive history of the US. And it's based on a very purity fetishist, one-sided analysis of US history. They can't see how US history is both equally a social totality that on one side has a history of slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, genocide, imperialism, exploitation, the repression of LGBTQ people, women. But on the other side, it has the struggles against that. And it's the force that represents the future that we define the thing through. So the US today is more defined, I think, by the Black Freedom Movement, DuBois, MLK, and these other progressive socialistic struggles, anti-imperialist struggles, than by the bad legacy. But they can't see that contradiction.
Mm-hmm.
They don't think dialectically. They only see one
Mm-hmm.
side of it, and because it's impure, they condemn the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
And in every instance, each these three forms, it prevents them not only from understanding things correctly, because they're not understanding the dialectical character of all these things, but it prevents them from organizing fruitfully. And it's not a coincidence that the people who do who do most of their work in condemning socialism and condemning this, condemning that, have been the ones unable to fucking do anything in their countries. Where are the successful socialist struggles of the people that do nothing but criticize China and Cuba and the USSR?
Mm-hmm.
Show me the proof that you can do better. There is none. So we have to overcome this, not only to actually understand things correctly, but to organize our people and fight for a better world.
I tell you, I believe that things are changing. Carlos, you made that comment about the qualitative transition occurring. I definitely think that we're on the cusp of something major. And I know that that's redundant sometimes. We always hear this, oh, it's going to happen. Today's going to be the moment, the revolution won't be televised, blah, blah, blah. But I'm talking about more so there's definitely something even within my own family, and it's very refreshing to see this. Like I had a conversation with my uncle, like, and we've had political conversations in the past, but I didn't really take them seriously. But my uncle actually engaged topics that I was surprised that he was engaged in, that he was contemplating these things. The first time, 41 years old, and this is the first time that he was saying stuff that actually I felt like connected. Like, oh wow, he's actually starting to get it. He sees through the bullshit propaganda. But my mom's not really that political of a person, but she made a comment during, I think it was the Summer Olympics in Beijing when that was. And it's interesting. You mentioned the Uyghur genocide, and they're all fucking NBC was talking about was like the Chinese, the repression of the Uyghurs, and they had a sit down interview with these fucking experts apparently talking about the Chinese um were putting these people in gulags and all this shit. And my mom was like, she just shook her head the whole time, like this doesn't like something's not adding up. Like, why the fuck has this been broadcast during the Olympics? Like, I know it's in China, so they're also trying to talk shit and throw shit on China. But people are waking up, and I think with the pro-Palestinian marches and all the consciousness from the university campuses, people are definitely not buying things like they did in the past. And another interesting observation is that the people that they feel more threatened by are promoting peace. It's so weird how the mainstream media is now because everything is so ran by the war machine. It seems like if you promote too much peace, that's like threatening to people, which is absolutely inhumane to think
Yeah.
something like that. That people who are promoting peace, you don't hear China talking about dropping bombs on other countries. It, is that
Mhm.
threatening? Like it's almost like antithetical to what we're accustomed to. It's like people who are too peaceful is like, oh my God, this is threatening. Are you kidding me? Like when did peace become this threat? It's like going back to Vietnam era again. It seems like where the peace movement was so strong that it was a threat to the system. And I feel like now we're getting that kind of a sentiment now from the people. They may be doing it in a different way, but I see people across the political spectrum like, no, we're not buying this shit, man. And I think
Yeah.
that's reflecting in the poll numbers. There's no trust in Congress. There's no trust in the president. There's no trust in any legacy associations, and so maybe there is something on the precipice. But I will say this, and I'll conclude with this. I'll let you have the final word. Any final plugs you want to give, and I just want to say thank you again for coming on, and Noah as well. CPUSA, I'm not trying to throw shots at the Communist Party of USA, but I have to say, first impressions mean a lot to me. And the first sight of them, or the first knowledge that I got of CP USA, I went on their website because people were like, Kiko, you need to check out the Communist Party of USA. So I looked at their site, and it actually made me not want to be a part of it. Like, I don't want to be a part of anything like that. The language, whoever runs the CP USA site, they need to get that shit together, is all I'm saying. That's my word of advice. Everything was like keeping the Trumpsters like out of office, like fighting against the Trump wing. And I'm saying to myself, you're supposed to be a Communist Party USA, and you're supposed to be a leftist party, and you're focusing on one aspect of the ruling class. Like, that doesn't make any sense at all to me. Like, are you like the Hillary Clinton wing of the Communist Party USA? Like, what is that? I don't know. You seem to be picking that up too. But I'm just like, that means a lot. Like, if you're supposed to have a consciousness and you're coming in with language like that, when you're talking about the workers, these people who are associated with Marjorie Taylor Greene, even if I don't like Marjorie Taylor Greene, you're still speaking to most of those people you're directed towards. Trump supporters are still the workers. So you're the Communist Party USA and you're trashing the workers. Like, that doesn't make any sense at all to me. But I don't know, make it make sense to me, Carlos. Like, am I just delusional, not making sense, or are you on the same page as well?
Oh, yeah, this has been the struggle. I mean, a lot of us are in the party. I myself am not. Noah is. Most of the people in the institute are, and it's absurd. It's not Marxism. It's not an analysis rooted in Marxism. I would even go as far as to say it, since I'm not in the party, I won't get in trouble. But it's a betrayal of the working class, and it's a crime against history. Because what this country needs is a strong communist party, because all a communist party is a people's party. Someone who's
Mm-hmm.
going to say, fuck the elite, we're going to fight with the people against the ruling elite. It's
Mm-hmm.
such a chaotic time as the one we're in. We were talking about your mom and your family members starting to question things. I have the same thing. My wife's father, lifelong working class person, grew up in one of those households where they were one of the landowners that were kicked out by Fidel, and so
Mm-hmm.
deeply anti-communist upbringing. If we had a strong communist party, he'd be a militant in it. Because he agrees with everything I have to say. And most regular working class people, that's the case. It's a shame that Noah left, but one of the examples that he always gives is that all of his co-workers, previous libertarians, they've all been convinced by communism. And if there was a communist party that he could take them to and not have them feel like if they're in an HR meeting where it's more important to to give pronouns or whatever, or have a progressive stack, they'd be, what the fuck is this? They'd leave in 5 minutes. And that's the last, we just did a panel with Radica, Gabriel Rock, and a few other folks yesterday. And that was the topic of the conversation, the divorce of intellectuals or radical intellectuals from the working class. I just published my presentation on the website for anyone interested in reading it. And it's already baked in to the social consciousness because it's primarily a middle class social consciousness. These
Mm-hmm.
people are at their root more concerned with the form, the style of Trump's politics than with the substance of fighting for the working class and challenging imperialism in its moribund stage. So, yeah, for a very long time, when we first came in contact with the party, we had a lot of our people join. We had a TikTok of close to 400 something thousand people. We're reaching millions. We were telling people, join the party, get active. Membership went up by 10,000 members within a few months. The numbers that they hadn't seen, I want to say decades, but perhaps a century, or maybe a little less, 8 decades or something. And a lot of us were just blackballed.
Mm-hmm.
We were because we didn't follow the line of the leadership, and it's the line of the leadership. The vast majority of members don't think like that. From the contact that the things that I've been able to see. So, there's a lot of stuff that can't be said on air. Perhaps I can say it after we're done with the recording, but it's it's a tragedy because I think
Mm-hmm.
the party, it's the historic party that we have since 1919. It's the should be the party of the people, and right now it's hijacked by folks who are siding objectively with the elite and with the powers that be, with the system.
Mm-hmm.
And if that wasn't the case, who knows what could have been accomplished in the last couple of years in terms of organizing? Because we've sent a bunch of people in there because we believe in the party, and and they come out in a couple of weeks like, what the fuck is this? Where did you send us to? This feels like a HR diversity, equity, and inclusion meeting.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a tragedy, but all things are in a process of change. No party, the state, uh, uh, in a state of permanence. It's all subject to change. And I still have faith in the party. And when it becomes an actual communist party, I'll be in there. You know, I'll sacrifice my career as an intellectual, my potential employment to actually militate for a communist party. But um, yeah, so I perhaps overshared a little more than we usually do because you know we're still in the fight. But um, you're absolutely right, and it's a tragedy, but um, we still got to build these networks with the people that we live around, with the people that we work with our family members, our community members. And when an institution, when an organization that can actually fight for us arises, uh, we'll send them in there and we'll build with them through that, and it's bound to arise. It's
Mm-hmm.
things cannot continue to go on in this way. It is impossible, not just unlikely, it is impossible. Uh, We have this phrase in the US, something's got to give. Something's got to give. It cannot continue to go on in this way. So an organization will appear, whether it's the Communist Party reforming itself, whether it's something else, whether it's the idea of a party. It's developed by Lenin, a party of a new type, of an advanced cadre of communists, but also a mass party, but advanced professional revolutionaries. That was a development for his era. Maybe today we need a party of a new type, or new forms of organization. Who knows? We have to be practical and committed to advancing, not to looking back and making sure that everything we do maps onto previous conclusions. But our judgment in every instance should be how much are we moving the class struggle forward?
Wonderfully put, Carlos. And I'll say this too, just to close, and I'll let you get some final plugs in to the audience. But I tell you, the CPUSA, if anyone that's affiliated with the CPUSA is watching this, take this as constructive criticism. I have no dog in this fight at all. Like, there's nothing, I have nothing to gain from trashing CPUSA. You can apply the same logic to the Green Party. There's so many chapters of the Green Party that are inconsistent. It seems like they're arms of the Democratic Party. So my criticism is basically what I've seen in other parties is no different than any of that. So it's not like directly exactly to CPUSA. It's just what I saw when I read the site, and the first impressions are powerful to me. So I just think that there needs to be a lot of reconnecting with people, and we just need to drop the labels completely when we talk about potential people joining a cause. But because when you do that, and I was telling Jay this, and Jay totally agreed when we had our third interview together, that you're ostracizing potential revolutionaries down the road by tagging these people like that person's a bad person because they're a Trump supporter or whatever, a Biden supporter,
Fascist.
whoever it is.
Right.
It's like that just to me that's like illogical, and that's not a smart way to organize anything. I mean, when you're demonizing people like that from the get go, people who you're trying to convince, that this is a positive thing for them when they're being indoctrinated in their own households about how
Are you
socialism is
saying
evil and this and that.
are you saying that starting off by calling people fascists is not a good way to organize them? Who knew?
That's
Yeah, no, I couldn't
hilarious.
agree with I couldn't agree with you more, man. Like, I couldn't agree with you more. And I think the vast majority of people agree with you. It's a
Hmm.
select that happen to be in positions of control, but we'll see. Everything is subject to change.
Carlos, are there any final thoughts you have for my audience? And what's the best way to reach you and Noah in case the audience member had a question or comment?
Um, well, to plug, I plug the Institute. Check out our website. We publish articles regularly, midwesternmarx.com. If you want to check out our books, we have an editorial that we publish books, and it also publishes the annual Journal of American Socialist Studies that we have. you can check that out at, again, midwesternmarx.com/books. We also have a store that we're planning on revamping, a sort of merch store. I hate doing these sorts of plugs, but after all, we do live in capitalism. But if anyone's interested in like rocking Midwestern Marx stuff, you can find that on the merchandise part of the website. We have Marxism schools. We're currently running a class, Educate Against Genocide, led by Professor Danny Shaw, but it's a very special class. We had like Thursday's section. It was a conversation with Dan Cohen. We've had various professors and specialists come in and speak about the history of Zionism, speak about the Palestinian plight, the current situation, the origins of Hamas, et cetera, et cetera. So that's going on, and that's probably going to continue going on insofar as this, intensification of the genocidal war against the Palestinians continues. But we've taught classes on the history of various revolutions, from the Haitian Revolution of 1804 to the Paris Commune to socialist revolutions. That was a class, Reform or Revolution, taught by Danny Shaw. I've taught on the history of Western philosophy and Marxism. Noah has a class, Basics of Marxism, that um, is the next time it comes around, it's going to be. I think in the new year we'll have a new class out, and it's going to have certain folks from organizations that perhaps we've talked about here coming in on a club basis as students. So hopefully that impacts something. Another class. So we're running schools, publishing stuff, editorials, and of course check out our YouTube where we do 4 or 5 broadcasts weekly, news breakdowns, theory stuff, history stuff, interviews, all sorts of all sorts of fun stuff, and our social medias, which are now officially all at Midwestern Marx. Previously, we had a Twitter that was Marx Midwest, but we found the person that had the at Midwestern Marx, and they gave us the thing. So now it's all consistent at Midwestern Marx, and the same thing for TikTok, which is uh, I guess the platform with the most following. We have like 150,000 people on there, and that's spearheaded by Eddie, who's a mastermind. You got to bring him on at some point. He's
I know,
tremendous.
yeah, absolutely. It's funny. I was thinking about Eddie when you were talking there, when you were plugging in the content. Soon to be Dr. Carlos L. Garrido, Southern Illinois University at Carbondale. Please watch episode 54 before you watch this one with Carlos and Noah uh, Khrachvik. I got to
Ashivik,
make sure I
yeah,
get that right. Yes, and Carlos Garrido in this beautiful episode 83 today. We just want to say thank you for my audience here at Kiko's Free Thinkers Forum. I had such a great time. I really did from
likewise.
start to finish. And we can't wait to have you back on possibly in March or something. I mean, we got to do this like every 3 to 4 months or so. I mean, it's just great conversation. And I learned something each time that people like yourself come on to the show. And we can't wait to have you back on. Thank you so much for coming back on.
Thank you so much for having us on, and it's been a pleasure. And we can't wait to come back on. Every time we talk, it's a very fruitful, insightful, and enjoyable conversation. I learn a lot as well. So thank you.
Beautiful people. We have so many interviews in store between now and the end of February. Um, I can't tell you. We have Wednesday. We have Vanessa Otero coming on. She was the founder of the original media bias chart, and we had, I won't call it a run-in, but we had a lot of back and forth last year with some of her personnel and staff. And the fact that she's willing to come onto the show Wednesday speaks a lot to Vanessa Otero. We probably won't agree with a lot of stuff, but I totally respect someone that's willing to come onto the show, knowing that there's going to be some opposition of forces at hand. But that's the whole point. We're not trying to be opposite to people. We're trying to understand people and maybe have a great dialogue and maybe have a better understanding. And based on the conversation with her staff from last year, um, I can only believe that we're going to have a great conversation this Wednesday with Vanessa Otero. We have Dr. Jack Rasmus coming on Thursday to talk about the UAW strikes and the strikes happening across the country. And Friday, we have Vinay Orikonde to discuss ranked choice voting. We have just some beautiful guests. Norm Finkelstein is coming back on for a third time within the next few weeks. We just have a plethora of people down the road. Enjoy the rest of your day, beautiful people. And remember, you can't unthink free thought. Cheers.